Imagine standing in the middle of a crowded party, your heart pounding as you watch the love of your life kiss another man. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she looks you in the eye, calls you a cuckold, and walks out with him while the whole room stares. That moment shattered me, but what came next? Well, let's just say they never saw it coming. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of revenge so calculated, so dark. You'll be questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. Stick around, because by the end, you'll either hate me or understand me. There's something surreal about walking into a room filled with laughter, music, and clinking glasses, only to feel like you don't belong. That's how I felt that night. The party was hosted by Amanda's friend, a flashy tech entrepreneur with more money than charm, and the guest list was a mix of social climbers and sycophants. Amanda, my wife, was in her element, dressed in a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, drawing every gaze in the room. She looked stunning, magnetic even, and for a moment, I felt lucky to be the man on her arm. But that feeling didn't last long. From the second we arrived, Amanda seemed different. She laughed too loudly, her smile lingered on faces that weren't mine, and her hand barely brushed mine the entire evening. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe she just needed to blow off steam. But then I saw him. He was tall, with an effortless arrogance that people like me could never fake. His name, I later learned, was Roy. He had the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you can get away with anything. And the moment Amanda spotted him, it was like I didn't exist. Her eyes sparkled in a way they hadn't for me in years. I watched as she sauntered over to him, her hips swaying, her smile turning predatory. My stomach churned. I stayed back, clutching a whiskey glass like it was a lifeline. Conversations blurred around me as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe I was overreacting. But the way her hand touched his arm, the way she leaned in to whisper something in his ear, it was undeniable. I wanted to intervene, to pull her away, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. Then it happened. Amanda kissed him, right there, in the middle of the room under the glare of the chandelier. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and heads turned toward me. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But no. There she was, her lips on his, her hands tangled in his hair like she'd forgotten I was even alive. When she pulled away, she glanced over at me, her expression cold and indifferent. "What's wrong, Jack?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Don't tell me you're upset. You always were such a cuckold." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the room tilt as humiliation and anger warred within me. People were staring, some with pity, others with amusement, but none of them moved to help. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. And then she was gone. Just like that, she grabbed Roy's hand and walked out the door, leaving me standing there in the wreckage of what used to be my life. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, I left. I drove home in silence, the image of her with him playing on a loop in my mind. That night, as I sat alone in our empty living room, I made a decision. They thought I was weak. They thought I was broken. But they were wrong. The drive home was a haze of blurred headlights and the dull thrum of passing cars. I couldn't tell you how I made it back without crashing. My mind wasn't in the car. It was stuck back at that party, replaying the moment Amanda kissed Roy. Over and over like a scratched record. Her laughter still echoed in my ears, sharp and taunting. And that one word, cuckold, hung in the air like cigarette smoke, choking me. When I stepped into the house, it felt foreign, like I didn't belong there anymore. The pictures on the walls, the ones of us smiling on vacations, holding hands on beaches, seemed like cruel jokes, lies framed in wood and glass. I stood in the doorway of our living room, staring at the empty space where her heels usually sat, and for the first time, I realized how much of my life had been built around her, around us, and now it was gone. I poured myself a drink, something strong enough to burn, and sank into the worn leather chair in the corner. The silence in the room was deafening, and yet my thoughts screamed louder. How did it come to this? Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? I thought about the early days with Amanda, Back when we couldn't keep our hands off each other. Back when she'd look at me like I was the only man in the world. But that was years ago. Somewhere along the line, things changed. The fights became more frequent, the affection less so. I'd catch her scrolling on her phone late at night, her face lit by the screen as she smiled at something, or someone, I couldn't see. And I ignored it. I ignored all of it. Because it was easier to pretend everything was fine than to face the truth. That's who I'd become. A man who let his wife slip through his fingers because he didn't want to admit she was already gone. But tonight was different. There was no pretending anymore. Amanda hadn't just betrayed me. She'd humiliated me. Publicly. Deliberately. And the worst part was I let her. I stood there like a coward while she tore me apart in front of everyone. The thought made my stomach churn with shame and rage. I threw the glass against the wall, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces. The whiskey dripped down the wallpaper, and for a moment, I imagined it was Roy's blood. It was a fleeting thought, dark and vicious, but it gave me a sense of control, a sense of purpose. I stayed in that chair until dawn, the anger festering inside me like a wound. By morning, I was no longer the man who'd stood frozen at that party. Something inside me had shifted, hardened. Amanda and Roy thought they'd won, that I'd just roll over and accept what they'd done. But they underestimated me. They didn't know what I was capable of. The first step to revenge is understanding your enemy. And Roy? He wasn't just some random guy who happened to charm my wife. No, he was calculated, deliberate. The more I dug into him, the more I realized that Roy was the kind of man who thrived on destruction. He didn't just steal wives, he shattered lives. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I spent the day doing what I do best. Investigating. People underestimate how much you can learn from the internet if you know where to look. Roy's social media was polished, of course. Pictures of expensive cars, lavish vacations, and him surrounded by beautiful women. But it was the comments that gave him away. Names, faces, patterns. A trail of people who'd either fallen for his charm or fallen victim to his schemes. By nightfall, I had a rough idea of who Roy really was. His real name was Roy Sinclair, though he sometimes went by aliases Marcus, James, even Thomas in some circles. He was a businessman on paper, running a series of small investment firms that seemed too good to be true. And they were. Roy's wealth didn't come from hard work or smart deals. It came from exploiting others. Failed partnerships, lawsuits that were quietly settled, and rumors of blackmail followed him wherever he went. But the most interesting detail wasn't about Roy, it was about his network. He didn't operate alone. There were people who worked with him, a tight-knit group that helped him identify targets and cover his tracks. One name stood out, Lisa Moore, his so-called assistant. She was the gatekeeper, the one who ensured no one got too close to uncovering the truth. I needed more than just surface-level dirt, so I decided to dig deeper. There's an art to gathering information without leaving a trace, and thankfully, I had the skills. I tapped into online databases, scoured public records, and even found a backdoor into one of his company's unsecured servers. What I found there painted a darker picture than I'd imagined. Roy's business wasn't just about stealing money. He targeted powerful people, men with reputations to protect and secrets to hide. And when he got what he wanted, he bled them dry, threatening to expose their weaknesses if they didn't comply. It wasn't just business. It was psychological warfare. I stared at my laptop screen, my fists clenched. This wasn't just about me anymore. Roy wasn't just a man who seduced my wife. He was a predator, and people like him only stop when someone makes them. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Amanda. Her name on the screen made my chest tighten. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I didn't need to hear her excuses or apologies. Not yet. She'd made her choice, and now it was my turn to make mine. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Roy thought he'd found his next victim, another husband too weak to fight back. But he was wrong. He didn't know me. Not yet. The hardest part wasn't finding out what Roy was. It wasn't even seeing Amanda kiss him in front of everyone. The hardest part was watching her act like she didn't care. Like none of it mattered. That's what hurt the most. But as I watched her from a distance over the next few days, I started to see cracks in the facade. Amanda wasn't living some romantic dream with Roy. Not really. Sure, they were together now, but there was something off about her. I'd spent years learning her moods, her tells, and I knew when something was wrong. She stayed at Roy's penthouse downtown, a glass fortress that screamed excess. I parked across the street one night, hidden in the shadows, and waited. I watched as she moved behind the massive windows, pacing back and forth, her arms crossed over her chest. She wasn't relaxed. She wasn't smiling. She looked like a caged animal. It wasn't hard to get more information. People like Roy have their routines, and Amanda had hers. She went out alone more often than I expected. Quick trips to the grocery store, a yoga class at the studio she loved. But she never stayed long, and she always looked over her shoulder, like she was afraid someone was watching. One night, I finally got close. She was leaving the yoga studio, her face pale and drawn. Her shoulders slumped like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. I stepped out of my car, my heart pounding in my chest. "Amanda," I called out. She froze, her hand gripping the strap of her gym bag like it was a lifeline. When she turned to face me, there was no anger, no venom. Just surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. "What are you doing here, Jack?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you happy?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the cracked pavement. "It's complicated," she finally said. "Complicated." I laughed bitterly. "You humiliated me in front of everyone, Amanda. You walked out with him, and now it's complicated." She flinched, her fingers tightening around the bag. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." For a moment I thought she might. Her eyes met mine, and there was something there. Fear, regret, maybe even guilt. But then she shook her head and stepped back. "I can't," she said. "Just leave it alone, Jack. Please." I watched as she walked away, disappearing into the night. Part of me wanted to follow her, to demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, trying to piece together what I'd just seen. Amanda was hiding something. That much was clear. And whatever it wasn't just about me. I got back in my car and drove home. The image of her haunted face burned into my mind. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe Amanda wasn't as in control as I thought. Maybe she was just another pawn in Roy's twisted game. But that didn't change what I had to do. If Amanda was caught in his web, I'd find a way to cut her free. But if she wasn't, if she was in this willingly, then she was just as guilty as he was. By the time I got back home that night, my mind was racing. Amanda's reaction wasn't what I expected. There was no smugness, no satisfaction, no victory in her expression. It was as if she were carrying a weight too heavy for her to bear. But the bigger question loomed. Was she trapped by Roy? Or was she playing me with another layer of manipulation? Either way, I couldn't afford to sit idle any longer. I spent the next few days setting the stage. Roy was predictable, but he was also dangerous. The kind of man who didn't just thrive on power. He demanded control over everyone and everything in his orbit. To beat someone like him, I needed to think like him. Ruthless, calculated, and utterly without mercy. First, I focused on his businesses. The shady investment firms, the hush-hush deals, it was all a house of cards just waiting to collapse. I started feeding anonymous tips to journalists and regulators. Nothing too obvious, just enough to get the right eyes looking in his direction. But that was just the appetizer. The real move was more personal. Roy had enemies, plenty of them. People he'd crushed, manipulated, or extorted over the years. Finding them wasn't hard. Disgruntled former employees, jilted business partners, even a few ex-lovers. One name kept popping up, Daniel Harper, a man who'd been Roy's right hand before things went south. Roy had bled him dry and left him with nothing. But Daniel wasn't just bitter, he was angry, and he wanted payback. We met at a quiet bar on the edge of town. Daniel was older than I expected, with graying hair and a face lined with bitterness. but his eyes burned with a sharpness that told me he hadn't given up yet. "You're wasting your time," he said after I explained my plan. "Roy's untouchable. He's got connections everywhere. Police, politicians, you name it." "Maybe," I said, leaning in closer, "but even untouchable men have weaknesses. And I think I've found his." Daniel raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across his face. "And what's that?" "Amanda," I said simply. He snorted. "You think that woman's a victim? She's as bad as he is. Maybe worse." "Maybe," I admitted. "But I know her better than anyone, and I think she's scared." Daniel studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's say you're right. What's the play?" I laid it out for him, every detail, every contingency. If we were going to take down Roy, we had to hit him from every angle. Financial, legal, personal. And Amanda? She was the wild card. If she was innocent, we'd save her. But if she wasn't, well, collateral damage was a price I was willing to pay. Over the next few days, the plan took shape. I leaked more intel about Roy's operations, enough to make him paranoid. At the same time, Daniel worked his contacts, pulling strings and setting traps that Roy wouldn't see coming. The goal wasn't just to destroy him, it was to make him crumble from the inside out. But the most dangerous part of the plan was Amanda. I had to know where she stood, whether she was a victim or an accomplice. And the only way to find out was to confront her again, this time with no room for lies. I waited until the right moment, watching Roy's schedule and Amanda's movements. Late one night, I followed her to a small cafe downtown. She sat at a corner table, staring into a cup of coffee like it held all the answers she couldn't find. I slid into the seat across from her, and she jumped, her eyes widening in shock. "Jack," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and firm. "No more games, Amanda. No more lies." Her hands trembled as she set the cup down. "I told you to leave it alone. And I told you I can't," I shot back. "Not until I know the truth." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging. "Fine. You want the truth? Roy's not who you think he is." "Oh, I know exactly who he is," I said. "The question is, who are you?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time, I saw something raw and unguarded. Fear, guilt, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of hope. "I don't know anymore," she said softly. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was a start. And as I sat there, watching her struggle to find the words, I realized one thing. Amanda might not be innocent, but she wasn't invincible either. And that meant Roy wasn't either. The morning after my meeting with Amanda, I awoke to a gnawing sense of unease. Her words echoed in my mind. "I don't know anymore." What the hell did that even mean? Was she trying to absolve herself of guilt? Or was she trapped deeper in Roy's game than I'd realized? Either way, the time for guessing was over. I needed answers. Daniel and I agreed that we couldn't wait much longer. The walls were closing in on Roy. The subtle leaks we'd orchestrated were starting to gain traction, and the heat was building. But the man was slippery, and we both knew it wouldn't be long before he made a move to protect himself. And Amanda, "Are you ready for this?" Daniel asked me over the phone. His voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath. "More than ready," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "It's time." That night, I found myself standing outside Roy's penthouse building. It was a fortress of glass and steel, towering over the city like a monument to his arrogance. Getting in wouldn't be easy, but Daniel had come through with a way to bypass the building's security. A friend in maintenance had left me a keycard and a clipboard. As long as I kept my head down and moved like I belonged, I could get in unnoticed. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped into a hallway lined with marble and soft lighting. Roy's penthouse was at the end, the double doors standing like sentinels. I didn't knock. I couldn't afford to. Instead, I used the key Daniel had managed to acquire, slipping inside quietly. The penthouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the city below. And then I heard voices. They were coming from the living room, low and tense. I crept closer, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. As I rounded the corner, I saw them, Roy and Amanda. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Roy stood over her, his expression cold and menacing. "You think you can just walk away?" he said, his voice sharp. "After everything I've done for you? I didn't ask for any of this, Roy." Amanda shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. "You dragged me into your mess. My mess." He laughed bitterly. "Let me remind you, sweetheart, you're just as guilty as I am. Don't forget who's holding the cards here." I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body screaming for me to charge in and rip him apart. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to hear more. "You don't scare me," Amanda said, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her. Roy leaned in closer, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You should be scared, because if you ever cross me, I'll make sure Jack pays the price. Do you understand me?" That was it. The last straw. "Don't worry, Roy," I said, stepping into the room. "I'm more than capable of handling myself." They both froze, their heads snapping toward me. Amanda's eyes widened in shock, while Roy's lips curled into a sneer. "Well, look who decided to grow a spine," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I took a step forward, my gaze locked on his. "You think you've won, Roy? That you can destroy lives and walk away unscathed? Not this time. You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his confidence unshaken. "And you have no idea what I'm capable of." I shot back. Roy took a step toward me, his frame imposing, but I didn't flinch. "This is my world, Jack. You're just a visitor. If you know what's good for you, you'll walk away now." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "And neither is Amanda." Amanda looked at me, her expression a mix of fear and something else. Relief, maybe. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Roy laughed, the sound cold and humorless. "You think you can save her? You're just as pathetic as I thought." "Keep talking," I said, my voice calm. "You're digging your own grave." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You want to play this game, Jack? Fine. But you'd better be ready to lose." "I'm counting on it," I said, my voice low and steady. The tension in the room was electric, the air thick with unspoken threats. I could feel the storm brewing, and I knew there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about Amanda or even Roy anymore. It was about reclaiming what he'd taken from me. My pride, my dignity, my life. As Roy glared at me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. Because I knew one thing for certain. The game had only just begun. After my confrontation with Roy, I knew I had drawn a line in the sand. There was no going back now. He was rattled, though he wouldn't show it, not to me. His bravado had faltered, just for a second, but it was enough to tell me that he wasn't as untouchable as he wanted everyone to believe. I walked out of the penthouse that night, leaving Amanda and Roy behind, but my mind was racing. What I saw in her eyes, fear mixed with hope, wasn't something I could ignore. She wasn't just a pawn. She was trapped, maybe more deeply than I had thought. Over the next few days, Roy's mask began to slip. The pressure Daniel and I had applied was starting to work. The leaks about his shady business practices made the rounds, hitting the local news and stirring up questions he couldn't easily brush off. Roy's empire was beginning to show cracks, but he wasn't going down quietly. I stayed one step ahead, keeping my movements calculated and my trail cold. Roy wasn't the type to take hits lying down, and I knew he would retaliate. The question was when and how. Amanda, however, became the bigger enigma. I shadowed her as discreetly as I could, watching her interactions with Roy and the rare moments she was alone. She was guarded, her movements careful, as though she were always looking over her shoulder. One evening, she made a stop at a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. It was far from the luxury she was used to with Roy, which immediately raised my suspicion. She parked at the back and slipped inside, her head down and her posture tense. I followed, staying far enough back to avoid being noticed. When I reached the door she had entered, I hesitated for a moment before pressing my ear against it. Muffled voices reached me, hers, along with a man's, low and urgent. "I can't keep doing this," Amanda said, her voice trembling. "He's going to find out." "He won't," the man replied. "Not if you stick to the plan." "What plan?" I thought to myself, my pulse quickening. There was a pause, and then Amanda said, "I don't trust him. He's more dangerous than you realize." "That's why we have to act now," the man insisted. "If we wait, he'll destroy you, and anyone else in his way." The conversation sent a chill down my spine. Was Amanda conspiring against Roy? Or was this something else entirely? I couldn't tell, but one thing was clear. She was in deeper than I'd thought. I waited until she left the motel before making my move. The man she had been talking to stepped outside a few minutes later. He was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and a weathered face. I recognized him instantly. It was Daniel. "What the hell are you doing?" I hissed, stepping out of the shadows and blocking his path. Daniel froze, his eyes widening in surprise before narrowing in suspicion. "What are you doing here, Jack?" "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back. "You've been meeting with Amanda behind my back?" "She came to me," he said, his tone defensive. "She needed help." "With what?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "She's trying to get away from Roy. She's scared, Jack. Scared for her life." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "And you didn't think to tell me?" "She didn't want you involved," he said. "She thought you'd just make things worse." The word stung, but I pushed the feeling aside. "So what's the plan? What is she trying to do?" "She wants to take him down," Daniel said. "Expose everything, his crimes, his connections, all of it. But she can't do it alone. And neither can we." I didn't trust him. Not entirely. But I couldn't ignore the possibility that Amanda was genuinely trying to break free. "Fine," I said. "But from now on, I'm involved. No more secrets." Daniel nodded reluctantly, and we parted ways. As I drove home, my mind churned with questions. If Amanda was telling the truth, then she wasn't just a pawn. She was a key player. But if she was lying, it meant she was manipulating both of us. Either way, the game was shifting, and I had to be ready. Roy's empire was beginning to crumble. Amanda was plotting in the shadows, and Daniel had his own agenda. And in the middle of it all was me, determined to bring it all crashing down, no matter what it took. The days that followed were a blur. Every decision felt like a step closer to the edge. I wasn't sure who I could trust anymore, but one thing was clear. Roy was feeling the heat. His behavior had become more erratic. He lashed out at his employees, threatening anyone who looked at him the wrong way, like a lion backed into a corner. It was the perfect opportunity, but also the most dangerous time to make a move. Amanda's meetings with Daniel continued, and I started showing up more often, keeping my distance but watching her every step. She seemed different now, less confident, more desperate. The mask she wore had cracked, and I saw a glimpse of the person she had been before Roy had gotten his claws into her. I didn't know if it was guilt, fear, or something else, but I could tell she was conflicted. Maybe she wasn't as lost to him as I'd feared. Maybe there was still something left in her. One afternoon, I got a call from Daniel. His voice was low, urgent. "You need to meet me," he said. "It's happening sooner than we thought." I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. The tension had been building for weeks, and it was finally coming to a head. I met Daniel at a small diner on the outskirts of town. He was already seated in a booth, looking over his shoulder like he expected to be followed. "Is everything set?" I asked, taking a seat across from him. He nodded, his face grim. "We've got everything in place. Amanda's ready to go public with Roy's dirty laundry. But we need leverage. We need a way to make sure he can't come after us." "Leverage," I repeated, my mind working quickly. "What kind of leverage?" Daniel pulled out a folder from his bag and slid it across the table. Inside were photos, documents, and a few USB drives. It was a treasure trove of evidence. Bank records, wire transfers, photos of Roy meeting with known criminals, even recordings of conversations where Roy had explicitly discussed his shady dealings. "This is what we need," Daniel said. "This will bring him down. But Amanda's got to go public with it. We can't do it behind the scenes anymore." I stared at the contents, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If Amanda went public with this, there was no turning back. Roy would come after us. He had the resources to destroy us all. But if we didn't act, we would lose the advantage. "I'll talk to her," I said finally. Daniel nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Just remember, Jack, she's not the same person you married. She's in this as deep as Roy. Don't let her manipulate you again." The words stung, but I pushed them aside. I had to believe that Amanda was still the woman I loved. I had to believe that she wasn't lost to him forever. That evening, I found her alone in a quiet park near her apartment. She was sitting on a bench, staring out at the empty swings, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. The light from the street lamps cast a soft glow on her face, and for a moment, she looked vulnerable, like the woman I had once known. "Amanda," I said softly, walking up to her. She turned, her eyes widening when she saw me. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, sitting down next to her. "About Roy, about everything." Her gaze flickered to the ground, and for a moment, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't think you'd come back." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "I want to help you, Amanda, but you need to trust me. We need to take him down once and for all." "I don't know if I can," she said, her voice breaking. "He's too powerful. If I go public with this, he'll destroy you." I finished for her, the weight of her fear heavy in the air. "But we have a way out. Daniel and we've got everything we need to bring him down. We just need you to take the final step." She looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm scared, Jack. I'm so scared." "I know," I said, my voice softer now. "But we're stronger together. If you do this, we can finally break free from him. You can be free." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then finally she nodded. "Okay, let's do it. For real this time." And just like that, I knew. We were in this together. No more lies. No more half-truths. The stakes had never been higher, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were finally taking control of our own fate. As I drove home that night, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I didn't know what the next few days would bring, but I knew one thing for certain. Roy was about to lose everything, and so was Amanda. But maybe, just maybe, we could both find redemption in the wreckage. The plan was in motion, and I could feel the pressure building. Amanda had agreed to go public, but now it was about execution. We were walking a fine line, and the slightest misstep could mean the end of everything. Daniel and I worked in the shadows, preparing the final push. Amanda stayed in contact, but I could tell she was struggling. Every call, every meeting felt like she was slowly losing herself to the chaos. Then one night the phone rang. It was her. "I can't do it, Jack," she said, her voice shaky. "I can't. Roy will. Listen to me." I cut in, urgency in my voice. "You're doing the right thing. Don't let fear control you." There was silence on the other end. Then, softly, she whispered, "Okay, I'll do it." And just like that, the game was set. It happened faster than I expected. One morning, the news hit. An anonymous source had leaked all the evidence. Roy's empire, built on lies and corruption, was unraveling in the blink of an eye. I watched the news, numb. There it was, Amanda's voice on the recordings, her face in the photos, confirming everything. Roy was being exposed for everything he'd done. But as the media storm grew, so did the danger. Roy wasn't going to let this slide. I could feel the storm gathering, and Amanda. She was now more of a target than ever. Roy didn't wait long to retaliate. Within hours, he had already begun to use his influence to discredit the evidence. But the damage had been done. People were starting to believe it. His world was crumbling, and so was his hold over Amanda. I found her one last time, sitting in the same park we had spoken in weeks ago. She looked different now, stronger, but still haunted by the weight of the decisions she'd made. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "It's finally over." I didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her. I had my own questions, but now wasn't the time. "You'll be okay," I said after a while. "I hope so," she replied, looking out at the horizon. "But there's no going back now." And for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Maybe this was the end, but it was also a new beginning. For both of us. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and betrayal was ripped away in an instant? Let me know what you think in the comments. How would you handle a betrayal like this? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more gripping stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. See you in the next video.